Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you for what will certainly be the most disturbing panel of your day. We've got with us an absolutely great, stellar panel, including Wolfgang Ischinger, who chairs the Munich Security Conference, which is kind of like the Aspen Ideas Festival for security nerds from around the world. And then we have General David Petraeus, who's one of the leading security nerds from the United States.
And proud of it.
And proud of it, exactly. We're proud of you. And then we've got Jane Lute. Jane and I did this routine yesterday, and we're back by popular demand. Jane was the Deputy Secretary of the Homeland Security. She knows a ton of things. She's working at the UN now. She does a lot on cybersecurity. And I want to kind of have one of those panels, we get this door closed here, we just have a private discussion among us in this room, okay? Because there are, when we get to these issues of homeland security and security more broadly, a bunch of things that ought to be said that can't be said in public. If a politician were to stand up and say, terrorism's a problem, but it's not such a huge problem, they'd be done. And yet, we would all benefit from trying to put these issues into some perspective. I used to work with a guy named John Gannon, who was deputy at the agency, and a really good, sound guy. And from September 11th, I actually stood next to him and Tony Lake and Susan Rice on September 11th, 2001, in our office, watching on the television as this happened. And from that moment onward, one of his mantras was, they're not 12 feet tall. The terrorists are not 12 feet tall. Try to keep it into perspective. Because when it gets out of perspective, they win. That's the objective. The objective is to create terror. And so the tally of a terrorist success, the metric, isn't how many people are killed, it's how many people are frightened, how many laws are changed, how many policies are changed as a result of that. And so I want to start with that, and I want to sort of go through what we see as another friend of mine was fond of quoting Jack London, as the wolves closest to the sled. And I want to sort of see which ones we think we ought to be attending to and which ones we think ought to be put in some perspective. And so, Dave, let me start with you. Let's take this terrorism issue and try to put it in perspective. Because you came up in the military at a time when there were existential threats and where we were trying to contain and manage those existential threats. And we seem to have gone from that era to equating these new threats with being existential threats. And I'm wondering if that isn't potentially a mistake.
Well, it is. First of all, let me just say thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be with you, David, and with Jane and with Wolf, and back at another Ideas Festival. You're absolutely right to say they're not 12 feet tall or 10 feet tall or whatever it may be. The problem is there are a lot of them, and the total height of these on a given day can seem quite considerable. But at the end of the day, the Islamic extremist threat, to identify that which is so significant, which is changing the landscape in the Middle East, which has created the single biggest challenge for our European partners in terms of domestic political situations in many decades, far bigger challenge than the Euro crisis, has certainly led to or been part of violence here in the United States, but it is not an existential threat. And so it may be the dog closest to the sled right today on Wolf Blitzer in that situation room, talking to those who have been in the real situation room. But in the real situation room, I think you'd be seized with a lot of other issues because you are trying to get ahead of some of these issues. And whether it's the cyber crime, cyber threats that we discussed in a previous panel today, whether it is Putin, North Korea, the potential for nuclear proliferation, and that getting into the hands of Islamic extremists would be potentially closer, not an existential threat, but a very, very significant threat, enabling them to do damage and the likes that we've never even really seen or contemplated in the past. But then all the way on up to what I think are actually sometimes overlooked, and these are the challenges to the so-called liberal world order, that the systems, the structures, the norms, the principles, whether formal or informal, that have stood the world in reasonably good stead for many decades since they were established in the wake of World War II, are under greater challenge now, I think, than they have been at any time during that period, at least certainly since the end of the Cold War. I think that's very significant as well. It's not the wolf closest to the sled, but it's one that informs the overall context through which we are sledding, and it's something that I think we have to be very concerned about as well.
I don't want to tip the balance of this conversation as the moderator, but I do want to ring a little bell and say ding, 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 because I think that's really the big issue.
We didn't rehearse this. I want you to know we had absolutely no preparation for this panel whatsoever.
But I think it's true. I think, first of all, the security order that came up after the Second World War is past retirement age. We haven't spent much time revitalizing it, whether it's the Atlantic Alliance or the fact that there really isn't much of one in the Pacific, even as issues arise there. The mechanisms of managing security, whether it's NPT or whether it's domestic institutions are facing problems. There's general distrust of institutions. Europe, well, let's just stop there. Europe, the institutions of Europe seem to be at risk. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the Atlantic Alliance is still the foundational alliance of global security. How much should we be worried about that?
Well, I think we need to worry about a lot. I don't disagree with a word that was mentioned, but I think that we face a double or actually a triple crisis. First, there is a crisis at the level of what we call, in our language, global governance. The Security Council of the United Nations, an institution created by the United States, by the way, not by China or Russia, has become actually rather dysfunctional. It's been quite a long time since they last resolved an important conflict. Look at the inability to get their hands around the Ukraine crisis, or even more importantly, the Syrian war, etc. So that's the first reflection point. How can we strengthen or re-strengthen global institutions and the respect for some kind of global rule of law, right? Second, there is, it seems to me, not in all parts of the world, but in parts of the world that matter, in the Middle East, in Africa, in the greater Middle East, there is an important crisis of the nation state. We have, as we speak, the clock's ticking, and each year we seem to have more countries around the Mediterranean, in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at Afghanistan as it was and as it is and as it will be. We have states that are either failing or are failed, and are thus becoming almost automatically potential home bases for the bad guys. So we need to make sure that we have a strategy that allows us in the West to help countries prevent drifting into this kind of failure to control their own territory and to have a decent government. That's a historic task. So unfortunately, I don't have any good news to proclaim here. I believe we're in this for a long time. I think the threat represented by ISIL is not going to go away, even if we were to eliminate it in, say, Syria or Libya, because like a hydra, they will reappear at some other place in the region. And my last point is returning to Africa. From a European point of view, it's important to note that the number of people killed, the number of victims, created by Boko Haram in Africa far exceeds the number of victims created so far by the Islamic State.
Well, I think that's an important perspective, and I do think every once in a while, we ought to let facts guide what our fears are. The reality is, if you look at the poll of the top 10 fears of American people, it tends to be things like public speaking, flying, things that will never kill anybody, when it really should be sugar, which is killing more people than any of the things we've talked about here. I want to get to you on this point, but Dave extended two fingers, like he wants to hop in on something that Wolf just said. So
I think it's hugely important to underscore what Wolf said about ungoverned spaces, because particularly in the Islamic world, they are going to be exploited. It's not a question of if, it's just when. They will be exploited by extremists. The effects will not be contained to the area in which they're. You can't admire the problem until it goes away. U.S. leadership is imperative in responding, and it's a generational struggle, and that has to inform all that we do, and we have to do it in a comprehensive way. You just can't drone strike your way out of this. These are serious lessons that I think we have to take to heart. Doesn't mean that we do it all, doesn't mean that we don't get as many partners, and doesn't mean that we don't get others to be on the front lines whenever that's possible, et cetera, because it is going to be a generational struggle. But the other point that Wolf had, which is that you can put a stake through the heart of an individual organization, of an individual leader, and we will do lots more of that. You can't put a stake through the heart of the ideas that are inspiring some of this, and that's, I think, a challenge that's going to be with us again for a generation.
Well, let me pick up on that, Jane. We talk, I don't know, maybe it's because we're Americans, but we talk a lot about personalities and brand names. So we talk about Osama bin Laden, or we talk about Al-Qaeda, or we talk about ISIL. When the problem is extremism, and we discover when you decapitate one group, another one emerges. Or franchising. I see the threat posed by ISIL being that it's sort of the world's first open source terrorist organization. So anybody can be a member. You don't have to be in a hierarchy. All you have to do is, declare allegiance, and it's a force multiplier for them, and it makes them seem much bigger than they are. Are we focused on the right bad guys or the right bad actors, or are we too guided by what dominates the headlines?
I think we're way, way too dominated by a national security mindset. And I think we need to understand the difference between looking at these issues with a national security mindset as opposed to a homeland security mindset, because they're entirely different. National security is strategic, it's centralized, it's top-driven. Homeland security is transactional, it's decentralized, it's bottom-driven, driven by the states and the localities of this country. In national security, the watchword is unity of command. In Homeland security, it's unity of effort. Information is shared in a national security setting on the basis of need to know. In Homeland security, it's duty to share. So there's an entirely different relationship between fear and the public and the leadership, as against national security or Homeland security. In national security, the country has to be attacked before the nation will go to war. In Homeland security, if you're a society, you're a community, and you are fearful for your lives or your children's safety, the mayor and the police chief are fired. So there's a very different orientation on these problems. And we talk, sort of I have enormous respect, and I've been colleagues and friends with all of you, and learned from all of you for generations, decades.
Wow, she's trying to lift us up and she casts us down.
Don't go there.
I wasn't going there. I'm way older than I look. But I think it's really important, because when you're dealing with these problems, this is all interesting how we think about it, and it's important. And we need a theory of the case. Let's take terrorism. What's been our theory of the case for 12 or 15 years following 9/11? Our theory of the case is the bad guys are out there trying to come here. That's what we think. How are we going to deal with that? We're going to find them and fix them, in a military sense, abroad. We have 3 tools. We have an intelligence tool, considerable. Our military, best in the world. And we have our partnerships, our security partnerships with NATO and with other countries bilaterally. That's great. What if they're here? What if they're already here? What terrorist strike can succeed in this country unless there is already a basis of support? How good is our intelligence capability going to serve us? The military deployed domestically? The Brits, NATO? Not really. So we need to think about the questions that you're raising, which are the real questions, from the perspective of Homeland Security. This country can protect itself. We can protect ourselves. And as we said for a very long time, we need to be prepared, not scared. And the Homeland Security agenda of looking at borders and immigration and of cybersecurity and of national resilience are all tools that we need to put on the table.
Yeah, I think, by the way, embedded in Jane's comment, there's something else to take away. We sometimes look at bad actors or external threats and we say this is where the risk comes from. But very often, the risks are magnified or exist more greatly closer to home, whether it's absence of leadership, institutional weakness, growing divisions within society that organically fuel some of these things. And so, we can go and eliminate 5 terrorists and not address the core problems that put us at risk. You agree with that?
Yeah, and this is why, again, you have to have a comprehensive approach. This is more than just, again, killing or capturing bad guys with either precision strikes or Delta Force raids or what have you. You've got to get at the root issues. Now, you've got to do it in a way that is informed by the knowledge that this is going to be generational in terms of longevity, and therefore you've got to be as cost effective, you've got to be as inclusive with your allies. By the way, among our most important partners in these endeavors are Islamic countries. This is much more of an existential threat to Muslim countries than it is certainly to our countries, as big as the challenge caused by the tsunami of refugees from Syria is certainly for our European partners. And so therefore disparaging them or the religion is not a particularly helpful way about going about getting partners. And by the way, in most of the successful cases that we've had or areas when we've made periods of sustained progress, we've inevitably had very important Muslim partners and institutions of Muslim countries working together with us.
So disparaging them is one thing that we see some candidates do. Another thing we've seen a prominent U.S. candidate recently do is disparage our allies. He started, well, by the way, the President of the United States said that some of our allies in the Middle East were free riders. Probably not so great for the alliance that you're talking about there. And then Donald Trump starts talking about how the Europeans are free riders. These are global problems. They can't be solved by any individual nation acting alone. Do you feel that a Europe that's weak institutionally, stressed by flows of immigration, unsure of its own future, and still reluctant to have any kind of foreign policy that's a real foreign policy that they can follow through on, is up to the challenge being a partner? How do you feel about the Donald Trump criticisms?
I don't like it. And,
There's not a big pro-Trump constituency.
as you know, if I were still, a senior official in the German government, I wouldn't say what am I now saying, because now I speak as an individual and it's only my own responsibility. I think for the leadership role of the United States, which we will need even more urgently because of these issues in the future than we needed it in the recent past, it would be an unmitigated disaster, if you ask me, if Mr. Trump were elected, because I think that would create, at least for a while, a rise in uncertainty about the role of the United States. What about his comments about NATO? And what about his comments about dealing with all sorts of other allies? And do we really believe that he could, if he wanted to, strike a deal that would not be disadvantageous to the West with Mr. Putin, who has been in office now for 15 years or so, who is probably at least as smart in terms of handling national security issues as Mr. Trump? So I'm not happy about it.
At least.
At least. But the But let me come back to the sort of to the more serious part of the question about Europe. Jane made the point, and I appreciate that. From the U.S. point of view, the focus has been primarily on how do we prevent bad guys from coming here, and then of course you have to think about what if bad guys are here. We know in Europe that they're there. We know they're in France. We've just seen it happen. We know they're all over the place. It's probably a little miracle that in my own country, in Germany, no big terrorist attack has happened, knock on wood. It will be statistically unlikely that we will be spared forever. So we know they're there. We know it's much easier for them to come into our countries because it's for all practical purposes not possible to completely control these many, many different borders, etc. It's a little easier for the United States with only 2 neighbors and the open sea on both sides. In Europe, this is more complicated. So our challenge is to make sure that this quote-unquote weak European Union becomes stronger where it matters. And one area where it matters is a more coordinated intelligence and homeland security effort. Quite frankly, I published a piece a little while ago which created quite a bit of excitement. I said, in the United States of America, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, for the first 150 or almost 200 years, they didn't have a federal police. And then for some reasons, they created the FBI, which is sort of a countrywide executive police institution. Has the point not arrived where in the European Union, in order to hunt a terrorist from Sicily to Norway and back, we need some kind of capacity to act that does not respect national borders, a transnational kind of police, like, quote unquote, a European FBI? Well, you can imagine the reactions. Some people said, great idea. That's what we ought to do. Especially those who are in charge of Homeland Security. They think this is good. Others who are more concerned about privacy protection and about the rights of the individuals say, the last thing we want is that a Spanish policeman shoots people in Denmark, etc. So there are concerns, there are fears, but I think that's what we need to do in Europe. And my last point would be this. There is admittedly a kind of a malaise in the European Union about the functioning of the EU. You know, whether you call it a weak EU or an EU that is increasingly being disliked, look at Brexit, etc. Part of the reason is that many of the projects which the European Union has correctly tried to advance have been seen by our broader public as elitist projects. And when you look at the polls, when you check what would people like to see the EU do for them, the one answer where even in Britain you get a positive response is security. People want to have the EU act as a security actor, not necessarily only in our military forces in the context of NATO, in Afghanistan, in Mali, in other places. They also want the EU to provide more homeland security. So if you look at the expectations of the people, there is actually a good basis on which to act and create a slightly stronger and more resilient homeland security structure in the EU. Is that going to happen in the next weeks or months? I'm afraid not as quickly as I would like to see it happen, because our leaders will be busy discussing Brexit, and Ukraine and Syria. They're overwhelmed at the moment with all these other major crises.
Go on, Jane.
I think there's a dimension of security, again, which you see vividly from the Homeland perspective. I mean, one of the things about the national security institutions of this country that, by and large, at a level of generalization, there's almost no interaction with the American public. Our intelligence community doesn't have a lot of interaction, it's not designed to, with the American public. The State Department looks outward, et cetera. The military, we've long lamented the fact that we're not drawing broadly from the American public. Homeland Security, we interact with 5 to 7 million people a day. So you get a very vivid feel for what people mean when they say security. You're absolutely right, Wolfgang, I believe it. People want to feel free from fear of attack. That's what they mean fundamentally, at home and abroad. But they also want guarantees against the unbridled use of power. That's the less articulated version of security. I think whatever the next president faces, whomever she or he is, they are going to have to lead the global recovery from the next 6 months, because we are in for a very rough ride as we have this public conversation about all of these issues, all the while facing what people believe is a deteriorating sense of security, whether it's financial security or actual security. So what are the tools that we have in place to reassure people? Because people are angry everywhere. And this is an anxiety-based anger. This is not a purpose-driven anger. When you have purpose-driven anger, people kill each other. This is an anxiety-based anger. We don't trust businesses, we don't trust the banks, we don't trust the media, we don't trust markets. In many cases, we don't trust governments or our institutions. And I think the anxiety stems from the fact that we may not know how to architect trusted institutions at scale in public space. And we're trying to and we're seeing that in evidence again and again and again. You mentioned earlier the UN is a weak organization. Compared to what? Our institutions, their weight-bearing effectiveness for social problems of enormous complexity has been called under question now across the board. So as we address proximate threats, what am I afraid of? What am I going to take action on because I am afraid? And what responsibilities should we assign to individuals? Should we assign to communities? Should we assign to police forces? Security is typically something communities assign to their governments to handle. We want safe streets, governments, you run the police. We want a safe country, government, you run the military, et cetera. And here again, the difference between national security and homeland security is stark. Washington is not the national command authority, as it is in national security. It's the federal partner. So the FBI, an investigative agency at the federal level, has really defined and limited responsibilities compared to, the 850,000 state and local law enforcement in this country. So we need to look at both parts of the picture.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions in 5 minutes. But I don't want to fall into the trap that I was trying to avoid at the very beginning, which is it's easy to talk about terrorism. It's especially easy because of what you just said. People don't want to be afraid of an attack. But leadership, it seems to me, is sometimes about saying, this is what we should be focused on. This is where the real risk lies. Let's be able to move past this. And there are some countries where there have been multiple terrorist attacks where they're able to manage them and digest it and handle it a little bit better, and it causes less terror as a consequence. Apart from that, Dave, as you look at it, a new president is coming in. What are the risks that ought to be prioritized? If you were advising this next president, she came, see what I did there? She came to, and she said, where should we be focused? Where should we allocate our resources? You listed some things. You said cyber, you said the rise of emerging powers. We talked about Africa as a place. There's a whole host of things. And we know that, in terms of terror attacks, a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of Americans die as a result of terror attacks than as a use of guns in the United States in sort of the normal course of action. 50 or 60 or 100 a year versus 30,000 a year.
33,000.
So it's grotesquely out of proportion, and one should be much more, of course, a source of concern. Where would you focus?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is to avoid focusing too much on the dog closest to the sled. And you do get sucked into that. You know, I've been, again, in these different organizations, privileged to lead very large ones, and it's almost inevitable that you get wrapped into that day's dog closest, that day's significant threat, that day's topic du jour on the morning shows and the afternoon shows and what will be on the Sunday shows. And so that's the risk, actually. And the antidote is to make sure that you don't end up, you know, nose to glass on that particular issue or stuck to that issue and unable to address all of them. Because I think what the commander-in-chief really has to be is like that guy in the circus who gets a bunch of plates spinning and then goes back and gives them the right spin to keep them all up there. And you know, you keep adding to it to the extent that you can with your bureaucracy do that. Certainly there are limits. You know, Jane knows very well. I mean, there's only one situation room. You can only have so many meetings in it during the day. I mean, we used to calculate how many crises, every now and then waiting for another NSC meeting or a principals committee meeting, just jokingly, how many crises can the country handle at a time?
Well, the people from inside felt that there were too many meetings as a crisis.
And that's why, it's 3 to 5, about 3 to 5 that are really pressing at a given time. And the challenge, I think, for the commander-in-chief is actually to look at other than just that 3 to 5. By the way, the deputies of these different organizations, which Jane was, of course, and Michael Morrell, my deputy at the agency, they spend almost all day at the White House. I mean, Michael would disappear after the morning meeting, and sometimes you wouldn't see him again until that night because they just have deputies after deputies after deputies. That's the one that meets at high frequency. And again, the challenge has to be focus on additional topics, because again, the long-range issue here, that's why I went from the very close fight, if you will, the tactical, to the very strategic global issue that I think is the big challenge, which is the challenges to the so-called liberal world order and to all of these different organizations, norms, principles, and so forth that have stood us in reasonably good stead. And figuring out how do you deal with a China that benefited more from this system than any other country during recent decades, because they achieved something no other country ever has, which is nearly 2 decades of almost unbroken double-digit growth in their GDP. It's unprecedented. But they are among the biggest challengers of this system, whether it's building islands where there weren't any in the South China Sea, flouting what will be the world out of the court on the law of the sea, airspace identification zones that interfere with other countries, just one after the other, and in the dissatisfied with the IMF, so you create the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Again, we can go on and on and on.
No, but I think it's a perfect
These
point.
are issues that you've got to focus on, even as you are knocking down the close fight targets. I mean, you can't let them come over the wall, as they say. You know, they're right outside the wire, but you've also got to be engaging in the deep fight.
Well, and I've written 2 books on how the U.S. national security process works, and I've been in the government and talked to a lot of people, and every single administration I've spoken to, every single national security advisor, the first thing that they say is, we do foresight really badly. You know, that this is what you're going to have to do. And if you have to have a special cell that does nothing but think about these long range, you know, the beauty of commanding what is the main effort of your country at a particular time in the military is you can get the most talented people. I knew where every Rhodes Scholar in the U.S. military was, and they were either working for me right then, or had just finished working for me, or were going to work for me. And we'd have these cells called the Commander's Initiatives Group that would be thinking about these longer range issues. And again, that's the kind of development that I think you've got to pursue so that you just don't get riveted to dealing with that day's issues. I know both of you would like to speak. I know a lot of people here would too. So what I'd like to do is, are there people with microphones in here? So what I'd like to do is, if you got a question, raise your hand, identify yourself, stand up, identify yourself, and ask your question in the form of a question. Keep it brief, and then we'll try to get some answers because we've got only 20 minutes. So let's go to this gentleman here.
Frank Mahler for David Petraeus. In the course of your talk, you mentioned the cooperation you're getting out of the Islamic countries. Could you elaborate on that? As far as I can see, the cooperation is coming from countries like Saudi Arabia, which on one hand are helping you, on the other hand, they are the greatest financial supporter of Wahhabism, which they are exporting, and is creating most of the problems that exist within the Islamic world.
Sure, and let me just start with Saudi Arabia. First of all, I think they're doing less of what you talked about. There's no question of what they have done in the past. Indeed, the mosque in Molenbeek was one that was built with their money. I watched, to a degree, the transformation of Bosnia in the wake of their civil war, serving there for a year, and in other countries as well. But I can tell you that when I was commander of U.S. Central Command, actually Iraq Central Command, Afghanistan, and the CIA, if we took anything to them about people that were financing extremist groups or anything like that, they would deal with it, and they did it quite expeditiously, because this is an existential threat for them much more than it is for us. Keep in mind that the current Crown Prince, when he was then the Deputy Minister of Interior, and our single best partner for the fight against Al-Qaeda when it came to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and really in the GCC writ large, Mohammed bin Naif was nearly blown up. He was blown up. He just wasn't killed by a bomb that was designed and put inside the brother of the most talented and single most dangerous man in the world, Ibrahim al-Asiri, who's this explosive expert in Yemen that we've been seeking for quite a long time. Beyond that, you've got countries like the United Arab Emirates, which are helping enormously in a host of different ways. Again, a very comprehensive approach. The other members of the GCC, by and large, doing the same thing. We've got partnerships across North Africa with various countries. So again, by the way, you can't deal in a country, you can't take action in a country without that country either approving, or at least in some cases, providing tacit assent to what it is that you might do. The best of all is the active engagement, and you do see that as well right now in this partnership against the Islamic State that does include Muslim countries flying alongside and certainly dropping bombs on some of the Islamic State targets, although some of that effort was diverted, of course, for the fight against the Iranian-supported Houthis in Yemen, which is another whole challenge for that region and really for the world.
And I think you would acknowledge, and this, any of you wish to speak about it, that cutting the heads off of terrorist groups or killing terrorists doesn't address the extremism problem. The only way to address it is to come up with a counter-narrative to the extremist narrative that is a positive narrative, and that's not going to be one the United States can offer. Those countries must critically play the role, right?
No, if you're going to counter the voices of extremism in cyberspace in particular now, and let's remember that the distinguishing feature, the single differentiator of the Islamic State, besides the fact that you have a leader actually who's willing to establish a caliphate, is the expertise that they demonstrate in cyberspace, and that is really a significant threat. It's been there in the past. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had this Inspire magazine that was very important, and you may recall was led by an American Yemeni who ultimately was killed, along with the editor of Inspire. But at the end of the day, you've got to have credible voices. So these are voices in that language, in that dialect, understanding the religion in a very scholarly way. And that is invaluable, and it's not something that is in great supply in the United States.
If only we took our foreign policy magazines and websites as seriously as they took their...
Your subscription would jump.
It would double to 20. Yeah.
I think it's, I mean, the one actor Dave did not mention is Iran. I mean, this region is not going to stabilize or succeed unless Iran successfully normalizes back into the international community. Whatever you think about Iran, it is a strategic player in the region and more broadly. In addition, it has borne a very large burden with respect to displaced populations and refugees. I mean, it's a very complicated relationship that the United States has with Iran right now at this moment. You know, the U.S. and Europe have not always agreed on the approach to Iran, but I think it's safe to say in this particular region, You know, the historically great players, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Egypt. I mean, these countries must succeed for this region to succeed.
Next question. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Adrienne Barron. I'm from California, from LA. As a child, we learned about speak softly, but carry a big stick. And after dismissing a lot of the propaganda in the media, I want to know, do we have a big stick? Or is it really outdated equipment in case of an emergency?
We have the biggest stick in the world by a factor of I don't know what. Look, let me, again, you know, people are entitled to opinions, but not their own facts. And the facts are that even with the cuts, and sequestration is the most horrible way to ever cut a budget. We've done some really dumb stuff. You know, it's not uncommon to hear people say on certain days that among the top 5 threats to our national security is Washington, D.C. itself. But at the end of the day, you know, we're spending $600 billion on our military alone. That is 4 times. Yes, China has increased dramatically. It's still 4 times what they have. One of the reasons that the U.S. has to lead is because when it comes to the assets that are crucially important to the kinds of endeavors we're enabling in Iraq and to a degree in Syria and some other countries, Afghanistan still, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance armada architecture that we have, which is just not all the manned and unmanned platforms. It's the pipes, it's the communications, it's the 150 people that it takes to keep one of these in the air and analyze what's coming out of it, listen to it, arm it, fuel it, fly it, payload it, fuse the intelligence with everything else, on and on and on, and do it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Then the precision strike. Then the industrial strength ability to fuse intelligence that is so critical to what it is we're doing. And yes, we're still improving what we're doing as we rebuild what we took out of Iraq, and that's one reason that it would have been great if we could have kept some forces there. I'm not convinced by any means that would have enabled us to have the influence to keep Prime Minister Maliki from heading down the ruinous path he did with the highly sectarian actions that undid all that we sacrificed so much to achieve during the surge and the subsequent 3.5 years. But we would have had platforms, situational awareness, pipes, all the rest of this stuff that would have enabled us to get on the front foot against the Islamic State much more rapidly. And that matters because the sooner you can show that the Islamic State is a loser, is the sooner it's no longer as effective in cyberspace. But make no mistake about it, our capabilities are more than all of the potential allies and partners around the world by several factors. And that's why, again, our leadership is absolutely indispensable. Doesn't mean we do it all, doesn't mean we shouldn't have every ally and partner we can. Churchill was right, you know, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them, and all that stuff. But work with me here, you know, I know it's lunchtime. But we've got an incredible capability, and we've got to use it judiciously, cost effectively, let others fight on the front lines whenever possible, et cetera, et cetera. But make no mistake about the capability that we have. And I'd say it's the same in virtually every area of governance, even extending into the diplomatic and development and other areas, even though we have never funded them to the tune that they probably should have been.
I echo absolutely everything Dave is saying, and not because I went to basic training in 1976.
Because we were professors together at West Point.
I mean, the United States can get anywhere in the world from Missouri. I mean, we are really that much better
Without
than anybody
landing.
else. Without landing.
And come back without landing,
And come
too.
back. And so the question that's been at the heart of so many minds is, what will the U.S. do with this power? But in Homeland Security, what we discovered is every other country has borders. Every other country is wrestling with immigration. Every other country has a federal, state, local, federal, center, periphery, province problem. And they come to the U.S. again and again and again. We could not open all of the bilateral Homeland Security dialogues that countries around the world wanted because they knew we were wrestling honestly with these operational problems in highly complex circumstances where values compete. In borders, on the one hand, you want to keep out people and things that might be dangerous, but we also want to expedite legitimate trade and travel. We want to keep out people who might be dangerous, but we want to welcome those who would enrich our culture and our economy. And we were wrestling with these. And despite whatever popular mythology may be out there, we are still a pretty special place.
Europe has a special relationship with borders, and I'd like to just pick up on what Jane said, because you had the Schengen Agreement, everything opened up within. Now you've got refugees, rising nationalism in a variety of different places, and questions about whether this idea of openness can exist in an era with these kind of threats. Where do you think that's going?
Well, 2 points. First, there are good reasons for us in Europe to be self-critical about the kinds of institutions and the kinds of things that we have created, such as, for example, the euro. We didn't sufficiently create hard enough sanctions to make sure that every single member of this euro system would actually not violate the rules. And more importantly, to the point here, when we created what we call the Schengen system, in other words, no controls along the internal borders, but only controls around the outside borders of this rather large area comprising a majority now of European countries, from the Mediterranean to the Arctic, if you wish. The idea is a great idea, and it has brought enormous economic benefit. And it, of course, it means that even you as Americans can go from Denmark through Germany to Italy without ever encountering, without ever needing to show your passport. The problem is the same privilege can be enjoyed by our friend the terrorist. So the question is, have we sufficiently, have we done enough to make the outside border control as effective as we should have made it? And the answer, of course, is no. When we created it, we did not reflect sufficiently about a situation where one of the countries responsible, let's say Greece or Italy or a country with an outside border in the region of crisis, what if that one country is either unable or unwilling or both to do everything that's needed to control that border? Do we have a plan B that can then be set in motion in order to make sure that the system works? The answer is we did not have the plan B, and we're now, slowly grinding out a plan that would actually create a force, a new European institution that would have sufficient personnel to execute these border controls. So, yeah, we are slowly learning. But if I may, let me add a second point. As important as the military capabilities are, and as important as it is that we in Europe also try to, lift our defense expenditures up to a goal that we've all agreed to some time ago, namely those famous 2%. As important as all of that is, I think the threat of terrorism and fundamentalist extremism in Europe isn't going to go away only by showing and demonstrating and executing military strength. We need, I echo what you said, we need a comprehensive plan. Part of this comprehensive plan has got to be, from a European point of view, that we do not regard, as we have done for more than a generation now, our policies vis-à-vis the countries in Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, as recipients of charity, classic foreign aid recipients. We make sure that people don't die from hunger or disease, etc. We've got to, even if it's painful, we have got to understand that what we need to create with these countries is a security strategy in which they can be partners, and a strategy that will try to make sure that over the medium and longer term, we will prevent new failing states, and we will have resources to make sure that states that are about to fail can be rescued from becoming platforms for ISIL or Boko Haram, etc. That's of course a huge task. I think we can do it. We need strong leadership support from the United States for that. And hopefully, that would be my last point, and hopefully the distraction created by aggressive behavior by Mr. Putin in Eastern Europe can at some point be eliminated so that we can focus on these homeland security and terrorism issues, and so that we don't have to spend too much of our resource on hedging against what is perceived in Europe today as a renewed threat, or at least a potential threat from the East.
Look, I think that's an extremely good point. I'm afraid we don't have much time left. I think we'll have a chance for one more question, but I want to put one button on that point. I had a conversation with the National Security Advisor of Jordan not too long ago, and Jordan's an absolutely vital country in all of this. And I said, what's the most important thing for you to maintain stability in Jordan and fight these things? And he said, oh, that's easy. He said, 7 million jobs.
Yeah.
He said, we have to create jobs for people.
Absolutely.
Now, the problem is that when you say 7 million jobs, you think of it as development. When you think of its development, for better or for worse, that ends up going to the children's table in the policy discussion. It's not taken seriously. And we have a bunch of impediments to solving these problems. Another is our terminology. I call it semantic risk, right? If you call certain things soft power, you denigrate them. You make people think they're less important. But it is through soft power, it's through cultural outreach and diplomacy and education and interchange that you actually change belief systems. And if you don't change belief systems, you can't fight these issues as well. So I would encourage all of you as you leave this room never to use the term soft power again. Because what people believe, what they're willing to fight for, who they're willing to support, is actually the basis of all real power. Take one more question somewhere in the back, because we've been up close to the front. All right. Is there somebody in the back there that you see? Okay. But very, very brief question, and we'll try to have a very quick answer.
Thanks. I'll try to make it as brief as possible. When you look at China and you look at Russia, obviously we've pivoted to the Asian pivot, and this is more for General Petraeus, I think, but you're all free to answer, obviously. Is China's more bullying for just sort of respect versus Russia has more longer-term desires to sort of regain its overall dominance from a balance of power perspective?
30 seconds.
Look, they both pose challenges. In the case of China, they're both partners as well as competitors. Russia, clearly there's a desire to reestablish as much as is possible the former Soviet Union, or at least the Russian Empire, and to stride the world stage, doing so with a significant decline in revenue because of the collapse of energy markets. China, the increasing assertiveness is very concerning. And again, as I mentioned earlier, when you put the two of these together, these are the primary assaults on this liberal world order that has stood the globe in reasonably good stead over the last number of decades.
Very, very brief.
10 seconds, just to underline the point. I mean, China is today, and will be even more in the future, the biggest, or at least one of the biggest economic powers, right? Russia is not a significant power in that respect. The gross national product of Russia is smaller than that of Italy, slightly larger than that of Spain. In other words, when we think about the threat coming out of Russia, they can't possibly sustain a longer conflict against a major adversary. It's, in economic terms, not a major power anymore. And the interesting thing is that how Vladimir Putin has managed to play in the major leagues, even though that's not exactly where he belongs.
Thank you.
When I was at Homeland Security, people used to ask me, what keeps you up late at night? You know, what wakes you up? Is it China? Is it Russia? Like, no. You know, if it's not unpatched vulnerabilities, the thing I worry about most, coming back to David's opening question, what am I most afraid of? I'm most afraid of the fact that we will lose faith in each other.
Bravo.
And we can't afford that. And that's something each of us can do something about.
Ugh.